I'd been walking alone for 5 days when I met him, if you can call stumbling into my camp uninvited a meeting. The trail had been kind to me that morning. Soft pine needles underfoot, fog clinging to the trees, and not a single voice but the whisper of wind and my own boots. I'd chosen this route through the Smokies for its solitude. The world felt quiet there, wrapped in mist and memory. I was halfway through dinner, spooning lentils from my pot, when I heard a branch snap, a deliberate kind of sound, not the random pop of a settling forest. Out from the brush came a man wearing a pack too big for his frame, a neon jacket, and the look of someone who hadn't seen a mirror or a map in quite some time. "Hey there, partner," he boomed, like we were old friends. "Mind if I share your fire?" I did mind. Every bit of me ached for silence. But in the woods, courtesy has its own rules. You don't turn a man away from warmth, so I nodded, wordless, and scooted over a bit. He dropped his pack with a groan, the kind that demanded sympathy. "Name's Barry," he said, holding out a hand sticky with trail grime. "Been trying to catch up with someone all day. Guess you're the lucky winner." Barry talked like he was afraid of silence. Within minutes, I learned about his divorce, his cholesterol, and the time he tried to deep fry a turkey in his garage. I nodded through mouthfuls of lentils, staring at the fire, pretending to be deaf. When I finally crawled into my tent, he was still talking, to the stars this time. Morning came too soon. I packed quietly, hoping he'd sleep in. But there he was, bright-eyed, chewing a granola bar like it owed him money. "Mind if I tag along?" he said. "I get turned around easy." I could have lied, said I was heading off trail, but the truth was, the next section of trail was narrow, obvious, and headed in one direction only. So I sighed and nodded again. We started walking, him ahead, yammering about every bird, tree, and ex-girlfriend he'd ever met. I tried to keep a few paces behind, but every time I slowed, he slowed too. It felt like the forest itself was closing in, trapping me between his chatter and the thick summer air. By noon, the sky was a hazy grey, and thunder began muttering in the distance. I'd been hoping for rain. It might finally shut him up. The storm didn't disappoint. It came rolling over the ridge like an angry herd, wind howling through the trees, and thunder cracking close enough to rattle my ribs. Barry stopped mid-story, something about a bad batch of trail mix, and looked around with a grin that made me wonder if he thought this was fun. "Guess we're getting baptized," he shouted. I didn't answer. I just pulled my poncho tighter and pushed forward, feet sliding in the mud. The trail narrowed, slick roots glistening like snakes, and the rain came harder, pelting the canopy until water poured down in curtains. I knew of a lean-to about a mile ahead, and every step became a quiet prayer that it hadn't collapsed since the last hiker's log entry. Barry, of course, kept up a running commentary. "You know, this reminds me of that time I tried to install a sump pump. Flooded my whole basement." I gritted my teeth and focused on my breathing. Solitude had been my reason for this trip, my reward after a long, crowded year. Now, I found myself dragging an overgrown golden retriever of a man through a thunderstorm. When the shelter finally appeared through the grey, I nearly laughed out loud from relief. It was small, just 3 walls and a raised platform, but to me, it looked like salvation. I ducked inside and shrugged off my soaked pack. Barry followed, dripping everywhere, cheerfully humming as he wrung out his socks. For a few minutes, we sat in silence, listening to the rain drum against the roof. It was almost peaceful, until Barry pulled out a deck of cards. "Gin rummy?" I gave him a look sharp enough to cut rope. "I came out here to be quiet," I said, finally breaking the wall I'd built all day. My voice came out harsher than I intended. "Just quiet." He blinked, his grin faltering. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself. "Oh, he said softly. Yeah, I get that. He put the cards away and leaned back against the wall. The storm went on for hours. The forest hissed and sighed outside, and water trickled in thin silver lines down the edges of the shelter. As the light faded, Barry spoke again, but this time his voice was quieter. I used to hike with my brother, he said. Lost him a few years back. I don't do well alone. The words hung between us, heavy as the rain. I looked at him, really looked. Beneath the chatter and clumsy cheer, there was something raw, a kind of loneliness that mirrored my own, though shaped by different hands. I nodded once, slow. Guess it's not the worst thing, I said, having someone to walk with through the rain. He smiled, small, genuine, and for the first time that day, we both stopped talking and just listened to the storm. The storm passed sometime in the small hours of morning. I woke to a silence so deep it felt physical, as though the forest were holding its breath. The air smelled of wet pine and earth, sharp and clean, and mist hung low between the trunks like smoke from an unseen fire. Barry was still asleep, curled in his damp sleeping bag, snoring softly, a sound halfway between a purr and a chainsaw. I brewed coffee over my small stove, its hiss and pop the only noise in miles. And for a while, I let the peace settle back into me. When he finally stirred, blinking blearily and rubbing his face, he looked about 10 years younger than he had the night before. Smells like heaven, he said, sitting up. I poured him a tin cup without a word. He accepted it with a grateful nod, both hands wrapped around the heat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The forest was waking. Drips from the branches, the faint call of a thrush somewhere up the valley. We set out late, the trail still slick and littered with fallen twigs. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of rain. Barry kept his voice low, almost respectful, as if the storm had wrung the noise out of him. We hiked in companionable quiet for several miles, our boots squelching in rhythm. I almost forgot to resent him. Around midday, the path climbed steeply along a rocky ledge, the valley spreading wide below. Fog moved through the trees in long ribbons. Barry slipped once, catching himself with a curse, and I turned just in time to see his right boot peel open at the toe, the sole flapping like a wounded bird. He stared at it, dumbfounded. Well, he said, guess I should have checked the glue job before the trip. I sighed. You don't have a spare? He shook his head sheepishly. Didn't think I'd need one. We were still 6 miles from the next shelter, and the terrain wasn't forgiving. Every step after that was a lurching shuffle, his boot making a wet, slapping sound that echoed through the trees. The man who talked non-stop for a day now grunted with each step, pride slowly leaking out of him like water from a cracked canteen. I offered to tape it up with duct tape, but he waved me off, muttering that he'd manage. By the time we reached the ridge, clouds were rolling back in, thin and fast-moving. The sun dipped low, turning the wet bark of the trees to bronze. Barry stumbled again, and this time I reached out, grabbing his pack strap before he toppled. For a second, he looked surprised that I'd bothered. Thanks, he said quietly. Didn't think you liked me much. I didn't, I admitted. Still might not. But I don't like watching people fall either. He chuckled, breathless. Fair enough. We camped near the ridge that night, the world below lost in mist. 2 small tents, 1 shared fire, and for the first time, it didn't feel like such a terrible compromise. That evening, the fog thickened until it felt like we were floating in it. 2 small souls adrift in a world made of smoke and silence. The ridge was narrow, the trees stunted by wind and altitude. their twisted shapes reaching out of the mist like old hands. I built a small fire in the lee of a boulder, while Barry wrestled with his broken boot, trying to stitch the sole back with fishing line. His fingers weren't made for delicate work. The line snapped twice before he gave up with a muttered curse and tossed the boot aside. "Guess I'll be hiking half barefoot tomorrow," he said, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. I tore a strip from my spare sleeping pad and handed it over. "Tape that under the sole. Won't last long, but better than bleeding." He looked at it, then at me, as if I'd handed him a gold bar. "You sure?" I shrugged. "I can sleep without an inch of foam. You can't. Walk without feet." He laughed, low and genuine this time. "You're a hard guy to figure out." We sat there, sharing the last of my jerky, our fire sputtering against the damp. The mist glowed faintly orange in its light. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Somewhere down in the valley, an owl called once, its echo rolling like a wave. "You know," Barry said finally, staring into the fire, "I thought being alone out here would make me feel free, but it just made me feel hollow. Like all the noise in my head got louder when there was nothing else to drown it out." I poked the coals with a stick. "That's kind of the point," I said quietly. "You sit with the noise until it starts to make sense." He nodded slowly. "And what happens if it never does?" I didn't have an answer. Maybe no one does. The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of rain and distant spruce. Sparks jumped and vanished in the fog. I felt a strange calm settle over us, an unspoken truce. He stopped fidgeting, and I stopped waiting for him to. For the first time since we met, I didn't want him gone. Later, when the fire burned down to embers, he leaned back and looked up into the grey. "You ever think maybe people like us, folks who come out here alone, aren't running toward anything, but away?" "Sure," I said. "But the woods don't care what we're running from. They just make us earn every step." He smiled at that, a tired, knowing smile. And for a while, we just sat there, two stubborn wanderers, quiet at last, watching the fog drift like ghosts through the trees. When I finally crawled into my tent, I heard him whisper a soft, "Thanks." It wasn't for the foam, or the fire, or the company. It was for the silence we'd learned to share. Morning broke, pale and silver, the fog thinning into threads that wove between the trees. I woke before Barry, the air damp and cold enough to sting my lungs. My tent was beaded with dew, and the ashes of our fire still held a faint, sleepy warmth. For a moment, I just sat there listening, to the drip of water from leaves, to the faint whistle of wind sliding down the ridge. There was peace again, the kind I'd been seeking all along. But now it felt different. Not the proud silence of being alone, but the soft quiet that follows understanding. Barry emerged a little later, his hair matted, his taped-up boot looking like something stitched together by a mad scientist. "Guess I'll make it a few more miles," he said, testing the patch with a grin. "You got some magic touch." "Duct tape," I said, shouldering my pack. "Closest thing we've got to faith out here." We broke camp together, each movement efficient but unhurried. The trail ahead dropped sharply into a valley, sunlight just beginning to break through the mist. For the first hour, we walked in silence, not strained this time, but easy, like a rhythm we'd both finally found. Every so often, he'd stumble on a rock, laugh it off, and keep going. By midday, we reached a fork in the path, one direction toward the next town, the other following the ridge for another 2 days. Barry stopped, glancing between the two. His shoulders sagged a little. "This is where I head down," he said. "Doctor's orders about my knee anyway. Guess I've pushed it enough." I nodded. "You'll make it fine. Follow the creek, you'll hit a road by sundown." He hesitated, then stuck out his hand. "Hey, thanks. For the tape. For not shoving me off the ridge. For letting me talk." I shook his hand. His grip was firm, a little rough with gratitude. "Take care of that boot," I said. He smiled, started down the trail, then called back over his shoulder. "Maybe next time I'll try that quiet thing." I watched until the forest swallowed him. The wind moved through the trees again, whispering softly. And for the first time in days, I was alone. Truly, comfortably alone. I should have felt relief, but instead, there was something gentler, almost wistful. The trail looked the same, yet I walked differently, lighter somehow. Later, as evening fell and the sun painted the ridges in gold, I thought about what he'd said, that maybe we weren't running toward anything. Maybe he was right. But somewhere between his endless stories and that foggy night by the fire, I realized solitude isn't about being apart from people. It's about being at peace with yourself, whether you're walking alone or beside someone who drives you half mad. And as the forest darkened and the first stars blinked awake, I found myself smiling, quietly hoping Barry made it to town before the rain.